Today I'm going to see if ChatGPT can fix a Nintendo Switch. For those wondering exactly what ChatGPT is, it's essentially a chatbot made by a company called OpenAI, I think. And it's perfect if you have no friends like me to have a conversation with somebody. Let me show you an example of exactly what this chat can do. Can you help me fix a broken Nintendo Switch, please? Perfect, so we've already initiated the conversation and it says, I'd be happy to help you troubleshoot and fix your Nintendo Switch. In order to do so, I'll need to know more about the specific issue you're experiencing. Can you please provide a bit more information about the problem that you're having with your Switch? And the Switch we're going to be looking at in today's video, I actually bought two of them for £100 off eBay. I won them in an auction. So we're talking £50 each for these Nintendo Switches. We'll be looking at one of them in today's video. So if you want to see me try and fix another one, stay tuned on the channel and a video will be out for that one shortly. I don't know how in depth I'm going to be able to go with ChatGPT. That's what this video is about, is finding the limits and how far we can push it and how much it actually knows about a Nintendo Switch. So it's asked us what the issue is. It has no power. This thing is crazy. It's still writing with 4 steps. It's given us 4 different steps and it's still going. To summarize, because I'm not going to read it out verbatim word for word, but make sure that the Switch is properly charged, which again, it's not because it doesn't power on. It does say though how it should have at least 20% in order to turn on. That's interesting. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if it's meant to have 20%. I think you can get away with having it on 1 or 2% for the Switch to turn on. Check the power cord. I know my power cord is absolutely fine. It does say check the charging port. So let's check the charging port at the bottom of the Switch. So I've gone over to my microscope and this is the charging port. Now, this charging port is actually a little bit out of place. Usually it's meant to be dead center, so we shouldn't have this room up here of like, I don't know what this is, maybe a millimeter or so. This shouldn't be here. If I show you a good working Nintendo Switch charging port, this is how it's meant to look like. As you can see, it's perfectly aligned with the outer casing. So let's go back to the chat and see what it says. I've gone with the charging port doesn't line up with the casing. It looks a bit wonky. Not sure if it's going to understand what I'm saying. Okay, it says, it sounds like the Switch may be damaged. If the port isn't aligned with the case, it can prevent the power cord from making a secure connection with the Switch. There's a few things that you can try. Carefully align the charging port with the case. Gently push or wiggle the port to see if it will move into the correct position. I wouldn't recommend that. You really risk the chance of actually tearing the traces on the motherboard itself, so I wouldn't recommend doing that. Clean the charging port if the port is dirty. Yeah, but if the port isn't aligned properly, cleaning it I don't think is going to make a difference. And try using a different power cord. If none of these steps fit the issue, the charging port may be damaged beyond repair. In this case, you may need to have the Switch repaired by a professional, or you may need to purchase a new Switch. Purchase a new Switch sounds like a very Nintendo answer to me. Now I do have what's called an ammeter. This little device will tell me how much current is being drawn by the Nintendo Switch, and it will give me a rough idea of what's wrong with it. So I plug this in to the Nintendo Switch charging port. Again, it's just a little bit wonky. There doesn't look like any damaged pins, so I don't think it's going to do any damage. So if I try and plug it in, I get absolutely nothing. Let me try the other side as well. Nothing. It's completely dead. That usually tells me that the charging port itself hasn't been soldered correctly because we're not getting any voltage through it. I'll be very shocked if it knows what I'm talking about. Crazy, right? If the ammeter is not showing any current when it is connected to the Nintendo Switch, it is possible that the Switch is not receiving any power. This could be due to a number of factors. So it says a dead battery, it says a damaged charging port, a damaged power cord, again we know our power cord is fine, a problem with the outlet or wall adapter, or a hardware problem, in which case you need to get it fixed again by a professional. It's crazy that it even knows what an ammeter is. I'm going to take the Switch apart. Can you help me fix it? Taking apart a Nintendo Switch can be a complex process, and it's important to be very careful when doing so. If you're not familiar with electronic repair or not comfortable with working with small parts, it is generally best to leave the repair to a professional. So it says make sure you have all the tools necessary, be careful when handling the Switch, disconnect the battery, keep track of all the screws, and follow a repair guide. Wow, this thing is crazy. I've got the tools that I need, so let's take apart this Nintendo Switch and see if we can investigate the problem further. I think at this point it's really worth noting that there were a lot of screws on this Nintendo Switch that were actually threaded. When I got down to the motherboard, I actually had to use a Dremel to get a screw out. So God knows what they had done before with this Nintendo Switch. So a couple of things to notice just whilst I've opened up the Nintendo Switch. This is fresh thermal paste here, so somebody has definitely been inside this Switch to try and repair this charging port. I'll show you it under the scope because it is not in a good way. This is the charging port under the scope, and as you can see, it's bending the plastic out because it's not sat properly, but that's not the worst of our worries. Those are the pins. Now, just to explain this as best I can, these pins here that we have are part of the port that are wiggling. They are meant to be intact with these shiny traces on the board, but clearly, as you can see, they are not attached together. Every single one is loose, which would explain why we're not getting any power through the ammeter for this Nintendo Switch. If we go up as well, we can see that there is plenty of flux. Flux is a liquid that helps solder flow, and it is used on most electronic boards when soldering. I don't know whether they've changed the M92T36 power IC. This is this chip here. There is plenty of flux around it though. Let's ask ChatGPT if they know what an M92T36 is. And we'll also ask it what to do with this port. So I've asked it what is M92T36. It says M92T36 is a model number for a component called a power management integrated circuit, a PMIC. M92T36 is specifically designed to be used in portable devices and is capable of delivering up to 2.5 amps of continuous current. This thing knows so much. I shouldn't be shocked because it's AI. I then said the charging port pins on the Nintendo Switch aren't touching the traces on the motherboard. What do I need to do? It sounds like there's a problem between the connection. Yet, if the pins on the charging port are not making contact with the traces on the motherboard, the Switch will not receive power and it will not be able to charge, which makes sense. Here are a few things you can do. Check the charging port. It says about making sure that the charging port is properly aligned with the case and none of the pins are bent or damaged, which is kind of true, but doesn't really apply to the pins with the motherboard. It says check the motherboard, look for any visible damage to the traces on the motherboard. If you see any damage, it may need to be repaired. Try reseating. Here we go, the charging port. If the charging port is not properly seated in the case, it may not make a proper connection with the motherboard. You can try gently lifting the charging port out of the case and carefully reinserting it to see if this fixes the problem. But you can't do that without a heat gun. Can you tell me how to replace the charging port, please? It says, certainly here's a guide. Gather the tools, power off the Switch and remove the battery. You don't necessarily, I don't know if it's saying remove the batteries in the whole battery. You obviously don't need to do that. You just need to disconnect the battery. Remove the back panel, which is correct. Disconnect the charging port. Once the back panel is removed, you'll be able to access the charging port. Carefully unplug the charging port from the motherboard and set it aside. It can't just be unplugged. It's soldered to the board, so it needs to be removed with a heat gun. Install the replacement charging port carefully, plug it into the motherboard, make sure all the pins are aligned, reassemble the Switch. Okay, let's try and get a little bit of a better answer. I said, can you give me a step-by-step guide on how to replace it? Here is a more detailed step-by-step guide. Okay, again, necessary tools, power off the Switch, remove the battery, remove the back panel, disconnect the charging port. Once the back panel is removed, you'll be able to access the charging port. Use the spudger to carefully lift the black tape that covers the charging port and then gently pull the charging port away from the motherboard to disconnect it. This is definitely what not to do. As you can see on this Nintendo Switch, here is the charging port. There is no black tape around the Nintendo Switch charging port on either side. And if you use a spudger to try and remove it, A, you're not going to be able to because it's soldered to the board, and B, you are going to damage the Nintendo Switch charging port further and make it 10 times worse if you try and remove it with a spudger. ChatGPT, it was going so well. Should I take the motherboard out of the case? It is generally not necessary to remove the motherboard from the case in order to replace the charging port on a Nintendo Switch. If you do need to remove the motherboard from the case, it is a more complex process that requires a greater level of electronic repair skills. Yet you definitely don't want to leave the motherboard in the casing, because if you leave the motherboard in the casing, you're going to melt all of the plastic that you have here and you're going to have a really hard time getting the port out of the case. It's not going to happen. Let me take apart this Switch and take the motherboard out of the case and see if we can repair this charging port. Then we'll go back to ChatGPT after we've done that. Now we have the actual motherboard underneath the scope. I can show you how far away these pins are to the actual board. Look at that, it's not even close. Good news is it doesn't look like we have any rip pads underneath, which is really nice. But I have made another discovery. If I turn the board over and we go to the P13 USB chip, what has happened here? This whole situation is awful. This isn't on correctly in the slightest. We've got a resistor here which isn't on the pad. We've got flux just about everywhere. I think there's a capacitor that's standing and saluting. Yep, just about, as you can see right here. So this needs to be pushed back down so it's nice and flat on the board. The whole area needs a clean up. This is the back of the attempted port change. I think there's a capacitor here which should be here. I need to deal with this first before we even look at doing the port. Let's get this swapped out now and cleaned up. Quick thing to mention whilst I worked on it, there is a little trace here, which I don't know if it's connecting to P13 USB, and it connects to this filter. Occasionally this can blow when there is a incorrect amount of voltage passed through the charging port. It can ruin this pad completely underneath. So I'm just going to take my multimeter, which is in continuity mode, which is the mode that beeps when we have a complete connection. I'm just going to see if we have continuity again from here to here. We do. So this should be fine. I think we got very, very lucky. Now, next we're going to tackle this charging port. So wish me luck with that. Alright, just to recap, we have changed out and hopefully fixed the P13 USB issue that you can see on the screen here. This is the back of the charging port as well, and this is the front, obviously looking a lot better. All the pins are 100% secure. The grounding points are all anchored very nicely. Let's give it a test and see if it works. I'm just going to clean M92 real quick, so it still has some flux left over from, I think, the person before. Whilst I'm here, I'm going to check for shorts around the M92 T36. The shorts might cause the switch not to power on, so I need to check for these now. Doesn't seem like we have any shorts there. I'm just going to check the BQ charging chip as well. Absolutely fine. And one last thing before we test. It's the P13 USB cap. That's fine. Whilst we're here, I think it's worth asking, what temperature should I have my hot air station to remove a charging port on a Nintendo Switch? I've broken the AI. When removing the charging port on the Nintendo Switch, you should use a hot air station set to a temperature of 350 to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. This should be sufficient to soften the adhesive holding the charging port in place, allowing you to carefully pry it without damaging the main board. I think it's pretty safe to say that ChatGPT thinks that a Nintendo Switch charging port is glued on to a motherboard rather than soldered. I think that's why we've been getting the contradicting information about using a spudger and the hot air being 350 to 400 degrees Fahrenheit, which I think is around about 200, 250 or something along those lines degrees Celsius, which just isn't going to be anywhere near enough the temperature you need to remove a charging port on a Nintendo Switch. It does say at the end that overall it's best to be patient and take your time when working with a hot air station, as rushing the process could result in damage to your Switch, which is 100% correct. I think it's safe to say that my job as an electronic repair technician at the moment is safe. I have reassembled and we're going to give it a test now, and there's a lot of people out there who will say, Joey, why have you reassembled the Switch fully? You shouldn't have done that, because there's been a lot of times before where I've done this and it hasn't worked and I've had to undo it and I feel like an absolute moron. However, we're going to check now. Do we get yes? Okay, so that's good. That lights up, it shows amp draw, and we get something on the screen. Let's go. That's what I'm talking about. This means that we have a good screen for the Nintendo Switch and it's taken a charge. I'm just going to turn it around and check on this side as well. Do we have charging on this side? Yes, we do. That is an amazing result. It means that both sides of the USB-C port have been soldered correctly. I now just have to pray that we don't have any parental controls. Currently it's at 0.14 amp draw. When the battery has a little bit more juice in it, this should go up to around about 0.46 amps. And then when it kicks into fast charging, you should see it go to around an amp or so, 1 amp. I've just turned the Nintendo Switch on, and as you can see, we have parental controls. I need to get these deleted somehow, but I do really quickly just want to make sure that the rails work. That one works. It's paired the controller. This one also works, paired the controller, so the controllers do in fact work. That's really good. I've connected to Wi-Fi and updated software, etc. This, by putting the game in, is one of the last tests. Does it recognize? It does indeed. We have a fully working Nintendo Switch. Once I managed to get the parental controls off of the Switch, I would have made a nice little profit when I go to resell that Switch on eBay. Remember to keep an eye out for the next video with the other Nintendo Switch. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, hit that like button and consider subscribing if you're new around here. Feel free to also join our Discord. There will be a link in the description down below, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.